Super. So, welcome everyone to Thursday tea time at 3:30. As always, it's 30 minutes. But today I've been given the reins to present, and I hope this omen of Paul joining a bit late isn't a bad one. We're joined by Paul Morris, who's the head of e-commerce for Havas Media, and two solution partners who will be covering the revenue optimization and fraud management that can add between 2 and 5% to online revenues. And secondly, the analysis of purchase data with machine learning that can provide far more effective recommendations and deliver up to 10% of online revenues as an increase. As always, thank you to our sponsors Hayes McIntyre and Lewis Silken for their support and useful content and plus free advice, which they are happy to extend to you, our lovely audience. So, we've referenced this before, but it feels like, along with Alex, you're on mute, this is the quote for 2020. For some, the pandemic has meant the prioritization of digital. For others, like Robert De Niro, our friend here, it has meant adoption. But either way, this period has been the catalyst. Walk predicts that global ad spend will be down by 8% this year. And according to new data from Nielsen, ad spend between the 23rd of March and June 30th dropped by 48% year on year. However, this isn't all doom and gloom. As you can see from this chart that says digital ad spend is still predicted to be up despite the pandemic. McKinsey has suggested that US e-commerce penetration has seen 10 years growth in 3 months. And as you can see from this chart, the Office for National Statistics indicates that internet sales as a percentage of overall retail sales jumped from just under 18.8% in May 2019 to 32.8% in just a year. And when it comes to groceries, the moderate estimate for the number of people who have ever purchased online grocery delivery of pickup in the US is up 49% from 24% in 2019. So we believe that the focus shift to digital won't fade away. And with its prioritization comes significant opportunities for brands and retailers. So, having previously held roles as Director of Digital E-commerce at Marshalls PLC, Head of Marketing at Tesco Bank, Global Digital E-commerce Director at PZ Cussons, led digital marketing at the Co-op Group, and now Head of E-commerce at Havas Media, Breathe, and crisp sandwich connoisseur, we're delighted to welcome Paul Morris to Tea Time. Thanks, Paul. How are you doing?
You scumbag. You tell me you wouldn't mention the Christmas conversation.
Well, I had to break it up. The stat intro can be so boring, so I had to break it up a little bit. Anyway, thanks for joining. Let's crack on because we're running a little bit behind. So listen, having worked across a range of sector and industries, can you tell us a bit more about the different approaches you've seen to e-commerce and digital across them?
Yeah, I'd say each wants different things. If I'm being honest, some don't actually know what they do want. So I think that the kick in of areas like OKRs and KPIs and measurement frameworks are really key. I think that maturity can differ greatly. This is a naff one, but sort of like culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you've got, people that can be great at strategy but have not got a great culture will always get beaten in my mind to somebody with a great, powerful culture that is willing to drive, whether it's transformation or e-commerce forward with an average strategy. So I think that's key. I'd say the definitions in the businesses I've worked of e-commerce and CX and even digital marketing differs greatly. So before you go gallivanting off developing anything, I'd really check in with kind of, like exec board level as, sometimes I've absolutely had to do. And then for me, seeing various transformations and changes, I'd say everybody's key in a business, but I'd say the senior leadership in particular. And if I'm being honest, I've sometimes seen too big a focus on IQ. I'm not saying I want unintelligent leaders. I think that the EQ bit sometimes can be underplayed, but I think most businesses are getting there on that. But then the PQ, so something I'd term the passion quotient, the grit, there's a lot on YouTube and stuff on business books about grit. I think that those senior leaders with those attributes will really drive the business forward. And I think transformation and e-commerce and all those things I've just mentioned then pivots really.
So, I mean, that all kind of makes sense. And I think for lots of people, they'll recognize those as the key pillars of how that works. Can you give any specific examples at the moment that you think are really standing out for you of people doing it really well or even not so well?
Yeah, so I'd say, I think that the ones that are focusing on it are focusing on areas like, web dev marketplaces, D2C, and then that integration of that ecosystem. So I think Casper, not really my bag, but I think it's Glossier. They're very good in kind of FMCG makeup area. I mean, the typical darlings at the minute are the likes of Brewdog. I think that they've done a great job, both from a CSR perspective, but also from how they're pivot. Again, I don't want to use the word pivot, how they're changing and adapting. I don't want to overuse word. And then, again, Dollar Shave Club started it, and then the likes of Harry's have moved it on. I've dealt with the likes of Cornerstone in the UK, that are UK equivalent, that, again, they've changed and diversified. And I think that those sort of companies are doing it really well by mashing the things I just mentioned before together effectively.
That makes sense. And a lot of those ones you've mentioned have been more contemporary businesses rather than the more traditional businesses that are coming through. Within those new businesses sort of taking the lead and doing some great things, and the existing more traditional household name businesses, are there any particular changes that you have seen happen that are going to stick, and what also might fall away? I'm thinking of the more recent pandemic, of course, but ones that will stick and ones that will fall away.
Yeah, so I'd say, I mean, e-commerce is an obvious one that I would say, but we've probably seen about 5 years of acceleration in whatever 4 or 5 months. I'd say then areas that surround that. So, I mean, we'll be talking about some later. So things like fraud detection, AI and conversion rate optimization, targeting, personalization, dynamic adaptive site design. I think that those technologies are starting to come through and make a difference to the bottom line. I mean, I've done business in a multitude of different countries, and things like social commerce, it's only really starting to come through from your Facebook and your Instagram. I mean, you go to China and they're a few years ahead of both the likes of the States and the UK. So I'd say areas like that are sticking and developing. And then, things like flexible working, who knows? I still think that some will be demanding people come back in the workplace, but then the facilitation, and I think that you've got a people work stream that's helping facilitate. And I think that those areas are key to stick with the changes that we're seeing now, and that at the very least a certain percentage of that will stay.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like for some of those things are quite tactical, but of course there are lots of businesses who are evaluating the sort of strategy in their approach. Is there a particular plan? Oh, this is slightly leading because I know we've got a slide here for you to talk through, but there's a sort of, as a framework or plan of action. Can you just talk us through this, which I think is quite useful for for your activation and what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So for me, we'll just not death by PowerPoint, just this one slide, but just to begin with, I think that a key driver should always be, again, it's a bit textbook, but like, what's the mission, what's the vision, what are the values? Then you move to strategy, and that might differ by geo-region, by brand, by customer demographic. But this is something that we're seeing, and we've started to build within Havas, which is this, you can see in front of you, this ecosystem. So again, for time, my fault, but for time, I'm not going to go through in detail, but really looking at both the platforms that you're on and optimizing around that, the solution partners that you can go with, and the likes of Grey Airworks are key for that. The marketplaces, again, I've only listed some there, but they differ very much dependent on country. Moving through to your marketing and that mix, particularly driving D2C, and then really the fundamentals that while some of these are built into some of the platforms as a plug and go like Shopify, others you really need to look at that ecosystem of AWS and a Google stack, and then within the middle I call that the value creation zone. So again, it's all well and good having all of these tools, but if they're not dealing with the people, the processes, all the way through to offline and POS and warehousing and getting the stuff out to people, and that last mile, which is a particular challenge still for many around e-commerce. I'd say it's using partnerships and working your way around that ecosystem, and different bits will mean different things to different businesses.
Yeah, and everyone's going to start at a different point in that journey, right? Some people being way behind the times and some people being up front. So if if there's sort of two or three, what are the big immediate opportunities that you think brands should be taking with what's in front of them and the current state of play?
I'd sort of, so again, just for time, I'd flip it a little bit on its head and say, look, what is that value creation zone for the business and for the customer and for the partners? It might be a case of plotting them out on a Boston matrix of what's hard, what's easy, what's high value, what's low value, and then plotting those out and seeing what you can do. Really showing those, whether it's in like a tube map style, so where are you now and where do you want to get to on different, like you've got a people line, like might have a tech line, like might have a certain brand line. So I think it's really working those, and then things will fall out from that. So whether it's the buzzwords of AI or VR or AR or video content, I think that really differs dependent on the business. So it's very specific to what you're after, and then you move down from customer and business need, and I think the rest kind of flows naturally.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I guess now might be a good time for us to bring in Chris to the conversation from Signifyd, because I know that we've seen certainly that Chris has got something that is particularly useful and immediate, especially when it comes down to e-commerce and transacting online. Chris, while this fire's up, over to you, mate.
Thanks very much, Ben. Cheers, Paul. Lovely to meet you guys. Yeah, so I'm Chris Hemmings. I have the pleasure of heading up EMEA sales at Signifyd. For those of you who haven't heard about Signifyd before, we use big data, machine learning, and a commerce network of transactions from about 11,000 merchants globally to help retailers to increase online conversion rates and reduce false declines. It's very topical from what Paul was saying as being on trend. All approved orders by Signifyd are backed by a complete financial guarantee. So if any of those approved transactions transpire to be fraudulent, we cover the merchant. And to give you an idea of scale, Signifyd processes more than $100 billion worth of online transactions annually. So what does that mean? That means that a customer that's new to a particular retailer is likely to be known to Signifyd. It's interesting that Paul mentioned acceleration in e-commerce adoption and CAGR models, because we have a ton of data, as you might imagine, for all of those billions worth of transactions. It's all publicly available and anonymized and aggregated too on our website, signifyd.com. But what we're looking at here is the difference between 2019 and 2020 sales. As you can see, in May, during the COVID pandemic, online sales peaked at a 70% increase in May, evidencing the same as Paul, the 5-year acceleration that we've seen. Next slide, please. If we look at the UK specifically of interest, you can see the massive leap when businesses were forced to close physical premises, drawing everybody exclusively online. And even when, from the 15th of June, when shops were allowed, non-essential retail was allowed to reopen, we've seen a slight dip in online transactions, but still 70% higher than pre-pandemic levels. And I think what we're all saying, and I agree with the gentleman the two guys who followed previously, new habits have been formed and are here to stay. So with those things in mind, those trends in mind, the challenge facing all retailers is holistically that acquiring customers is and always has been expensive. You know, companies spend a massive amount of money on SEO, search, affiliate marketing, brand partnerships, etc. And consumers, because of the likes of Google, Apple, Facebook, etc., Amazon, have unrealistic expectations. They expect frictionless and convenient experiences. And yet, despite those things, the liability for card not present transactions, so those made online or over the phone, the liability for fraud sits with the retailer. And their main partner in this business, the payment gateways, unfortunately for the retailer, have a fraud rate bias. They would rather the retailer has a lower fraud rate than a higher approval rate. The two things tend to go hand in hand, and tantamount to that is this idea of consumer experience, etc. So this is a very stereotypical e-commerce funnel that we see from retailers. This notion that the fear of loss drives down conversion rates. So for every 100 orders typically that retailers receive, actually only about 86 to 90% of those get shipped. That's the turquoise blue funnel. And yet certain retailers do also still see both fraud and abuse chargebacks. So this is where Signifyd can come in. So this just shows you the transformation from the pre and post. This is the revenue optimization on average that we bring about through the use of our commerce network and commerce protection platform. So that increase there in terms of the shipped orders, whilst completely mitigating all of the fraud risk. And final slide from me is a case study. So this is, it's interesting, Paul mentioned the people that are doing it well. The bed in a box manufacturers are doing very well. So Emma Mattress is a long-term client of Signifyd's. They have been with us for about a year or so. They've seen more than a 10% increase in top line revenues through our commerce network approving more transactions, whilst completely, as I say, transitioning any fraud risk from Emma to ourselves.
Great. Chris, that was really good. Paul, I don't suppose you've got any particular questions. I'm sure this is actually quite high on your agenda, considering what we talked about earlier.
To say I've heard of you guys is an understatement. So maybe I've got quite a few, but for time I'll maybe only ask one, two, or three. But I'd say, what's that time to value? So I was mentioning about that value creation zone, and a lot of people will be looking at how you can drive value from the solution. So how do you drive that value and sort of timelines? Could you give me an idea on that?
Excuse me. So there's a couple of typically two types of implementations. As it says here, we have exclusive partnerships with many of the e-commerce platforms, Paul, that you had on your slide. So for the platforms that have app stores, the likes of Shopify, BigCommerce, we're live in about 30 seconds. It's about 5 clicks. For Magento, it's probably 2 to 3 hours for a suitable developer. We're natively integrated within that platform as well. And then we have cartridges for some of the larger, more enterprise type e-commerce platforms. So those kind of projects use an API integration. It might take a week to 2 weeks. But the really important thing from our perspective and the way that the solution works, machine learning and AI is great, but you need big data and good quality data in order to have really good decisions. So for us, it's more about aligning on the data quality piece and ensuring that we're driving that optimal approval rate.
And maybe if I ask maybe one or two more if I've got time, Ben, but yeah. The fraud related challenges relating to retailers now, what are you seeing those post-COVID? So what are we seeing that's coming through? Are they any different than pre-COVID?
Undoubtedly, right? So there's perhaps a couple of obvious examples because of the contact difference. Historically, when people had items that were bought online, they'd be delivered to your home. You would probably have to provide a signature or some form of identification to show who you were. I don't know whether you've noticed, most of us, I'm ordering stuff from Amazon every day. Most of the time, stuff just gets doorstepped. Boxes are left on the doorstep. And if you're in, great. If you're not, you run the risk of that disappearing. So these kind of abuse scenarios are definitely on the rise because people know that you don't have to sign to receive goods. So there's not that kind of carrier insurance that you used to get from DPD, UPS, etc. So that risk, again, is just sitting squarely with the merchant. That's massively on the rise. I'd say the other ones are obvious. Account takeover, right? Volumes are up, operations are strained, people are working remotely, and for the fraudsters, it's Christmas, right? So they try and attack different accounts. And then the final one would be retailers are not naive. They're offering new and convenient scenarios and partnering up with each other to offer things like, for example, Sainsbury's. When you go and pick your shopping up now, I haven't been into a supermarket. I just drive up with my car. Somebody meets me in the car park. He pushes a box towards me and I unload that and put that in my car. These examples are applied to all types of retailers where you're not necessarily having to prove your ID and key data points are missing from that verification of who I am. So it's just a fraudster's dream at the moment. Fraud pressure is up about 400%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Any time for questions, Ben? Or
I think if you've got a quick one, Paul, I think we could go really quickly and then on to the next one.
So maybe top one or two. So what are the key those types of growing fraud? Is it sort of your click and collect and the drop off? Are those the key bits of fraud that we're seeing that you're having to deal with as problems? Maybe the top one or two.
Yeah. So just we've had a few stats. Let's throw another one in. Click and collect is set to rise by about 45.8%, right? So this is a £10 billion business to the UK. And I think that the notion that consumers expect convenience, I said that as one of my main challenges earlier. But if you think about the use case whereby when you get something delivered to your house, that retailer has a delivery address that they can identify you by. They can build a record up upon that. with click and collect, these kind of key data points are missing. So people are just using mules, they're using fake IDs, very much easier. And again, it's just convenience to the consumer, but more and more threat and more problems to the retailer.
Great. So look, bringing it a bit higher before we get deep into fraud. I thought the next person we're bringing in, and thanks, Chris, we're actually bringing in a surprise guest who's already on the call, because this time we're asking Alex Meisel to present Netwave. So Alex, over to you to explain a bit more about how we can sell more online. I'm going to use the quote from earlier. Alex, you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Oh, is he front now?
You're still, there you are.
It didn't come off mute. I've never had that happen before. Yeah, Ben, thanks very much. As our friends from Netwave are French, they have asked us to present on their behalf. So who is Netwave? Quite simply, Netwave is the most amazing technology which boosts the performance of e-commerce and online advertising using proper AI, originally developed for the French nuclear industry. To date, they've never lost an A/B test. So when we talk about boosting performance, what are we talking about, and what sort of sectors are we talking about? Well, ultimately, where Netwave comes into their own is for product recommendations, personalized advertising, and actually content personalization on any form of site. And why is this needed? Well, to be honest, in the good old days, when you had a shopkeeper knew who you were and was able to actually make recommendations based on understanding your behavior. So that was great. And you might say, okay, well, these days, you know, the likes of Amazon are really good at doing it. Therefore, when I buy a product, and this is a real example, someone bought a baseball bat and they were actually advised to buy a balaclava with it. So recommendations do not always work perfectly, and using the best quality technology to deliver a better experience is key. So why is Netwave better than other solutions out there? Well, quite simply, it uses I'm sorry about this, my computer's going mad. It uses a completely different type of approach, which they call inductive technology, as opposed to the normal deep machine learning approach from other companies. So rather than visitors being shoehorned into segments, the way Netwave works is it's the equivalent of a salesperson for every single visitor. Traditional systems focus on what's sold in the past. Netwave focuses on what is selling now, in the here and now. So an event happens, something happens on television, someone turns up with a dress, people will immediately start looking for that dress. What sold in the past has no relevance to the interest in that specific dress at this moment in time. Traditional systems, you have to do the work, whereas with Netwave, the AI actually does the work for you. And rather than being controlled by stats and historical data, you brief the AI and it just goes off and does what it needs to do. So what does that deliver in real terms? Well, typically the automated e-commerce function for a typical e-commerce company will save 1 to 4 full-time staff. You'll typically see a 10% uplift in revenue, and even things like email will deliver typically a more than 40% increase in engagement. That must mean that it's really difficult to integrate. Absolutely not. We just require access to your tag management system and a product feed, and typically we're ready to go in 3 to 6 days. Reporting is also a doddle. There are a suite of tools which allow you to see how you're performing, and the way the AI works, it allows you to differentiate between all types of visitors, whether it's a first-time visitor, whether it's someone you know something about, return visitor, etc., etc. And in terms of real case studies, well, 3 examples for you. Francis Lefebvre in France, a professional trade publisher, 28% of their site revenues now come from Netwave. La Redoute, as they call it in France, or La Redoubt over here, saw a 51% increase in banner clicks, and good old Morrison's saw a 55% increase in click-through revenues. And so to finish off, retention goes up, revenue per visit goes up, conversion increases, basket value increases, and pages viewed increase as well. That's it.
So Paul, while you think about your questions, we can point the finger at Alex to show how hard it is to do the presentation in 3 minutes, which was 3 minutes 40, Alex.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Paul.
And the picture there is all about suits you for those older in the tooth or longer in the tooth.
No idea about that. So Alex, I mean, so again, I've heard of the tech and it just sounds, it sounds awesome actually, but playing devil's advocate, like, come on, is it really, I'm more used, I must say, to dealing with crow teams, in-house teams or agencies. Is it really that easy and useful to do? Because why isn't everybody doing it?
So using in-house teams as opposed to technology, sadly these days computers are cleverer than people. And whilst I completely get that in-house merchandisers know everything there is to know about the product range, in every test, what we tend to do with a more nervous client is say, okay, within this area of 5 recommendations, let us do 3 of them using AI, and you have 2 spots for your in-house experts. Within a matter of weeks, all 5 of the recommendations move on to AI as the retailer accepts it. Why people don't do it? There are a number of reasons. One is the usual fear, anxiety, and doubt. One is people just assume that all recommendation engines are the same, but that is far from the truth, and that is why proper AI, rather than a sort of simplistic rules-based solution, which tends to be tacked on to existing sort of platform approaches, that's the most basic level. But if you include something like Netwave, you will immediately see an uplift in revenues, which is really quite notable. And rather than just making those claims, the easiest thing to do is to do an A/B test and see for yourselves.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So as you were talking, and I was thinking about sort of the practicality. So I'm thinking like first-party cookies, GDPR, access to CRM data. Does it need access to things like loyalty data and previous purchase history to work and optimize?
So the more data it can ingest, the better. But if there is no data available at all it will do is it will compare your behavior to similar people at a similar moment in time and how they behaved on the site. So further data can only enhance and reinforce the offering. As far as GDPR is concerned, it's completely GDPR compliant. It's always the retailer's data and it stays within the system.
Brilliant, thank you. I think for time, that's it. But yeah, sounds great.
No, appreciate that, and thanks, Paul. So listen, we heard from Signifyd how you can unlock revenues with very little disruption to your business and none to the consumer, importantly, and obviously with further evidence that online shopping is going to stick, and certainly click and collect from the cheeky stat Chris threw in. And Netwave, of course, who enable new revenues by making the most of long tails and generating higher converting recommendations and engagement, plus how not to offer balaclavas with baseball bats when you purchase them, which seems a little bit skewed. Thanks very much to all our speakers, to Chris Hemmings from Signifyd, to Netwave, Alex representing Netwave, of course, Paul Morris from Havas Media. And thanks very much as well to our sponsors, Lewis, Silk and Hayes McIntyre, always around to help. Our next tea time is going to be September the 10th, so 4 weeks from now, where we hope we'll be speaking with some senior teams at PepsiCo. So for now, we did it in 31 minutes, and thank you very much for your time. Hope everyone's staying cool.